Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. Today we're looking at the best of the 80s in 2019. Hey, how are you? What's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. I'm Jamie, and it might seem a little weird to look at what happened in the 80s in the past year, but this is more of a kind of recap on some of the most interesting things I found and researched and wrote about and podcasted about related to the 80s in the past year. I'm a big fan of those, top 10 lists and season recaps and yearly recaps and all that sort of thing. So what we're going to look at are some sort of quick snippet takeaways on specific topics that, again, I found the most interesting. Specifically, we'll look at the origins of the PG-13 rating. We'll look at the E.T. Atari video game, which is noted as the worst video game in history. We're going to look at why the Top Gun VHS release in 1986 changed how we consume media and home video. And last but not least, we'll be looking at the great Michael Keaton backlash of the 80s when he was chosen to play Batman. Okay, you ready? Let's do this. So starting with the PG-13 rating, and it's hard to think of a time when PG-13 didn't exist, but it's been the most prominent and highest grossing movie rating there is. And it all starts with Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So Raiders of the Lost Ark was a great movie, full of adventure, action, intrigue. It set the stage for one of the greatest trilogies of all time. But like The Empire Strikes Back, the second installment of the series took on a darker tone. And this might have all been related to toy sales and a divorce. And specifically, I remember seeing The Temple of Doom, not in the theaters, but later on, and being pretty horrified by it. It came out in 1984. I was only 7, so there's no way in hell I would be able to see that till years and years later. But if you were a normal kid, say 10 to 12, 13, 14, there was no way you didn't want to see this movie after how awesome Raiders of the Lost Ark was. And Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom came with a normal PG rating. So what could be so bad about it? So it turns out a lot. George Lucas had just gotten divorced, and Steven Spielberg was going through a breakup. So a lot of this anger and darkness would be reflected in the film. Their bad moods would lead to scenes that included human sacrifice, child slaves dying in their parents' arms, and eating snakes and brains, among a lot of other violence. And this was a PG-rated movie. Spielberg had been doing this for a while, in fairness, with movies like Poltergeist and Gremlins. Gremlins really seemed to appeal to kids with the cute little Mowgli featured in the commercials and Gizmo, that whole thing. They definitely didn't show that blender shot in the trailers. Poltergeist itself was supposed to get an R rating until Spielberg fought to get it reduced. So this is where the whole, toy sales dictating movie ratings comes into play. So due to the monumental success of toy sales, especially because of Star Wars and how that carried over, any toys that were attached to movie properties were very lucrative. For every $1 that Star Wars movies have made, they've made $2 in toy sales. That's how much more important the merchandising is. So it's imperative to get any of these new franchises in front of as many kids' eyes as possible. And what better way to do that than with a regular PG rating? Kids won't give a crap about toys from a movie they aren't allowed to see. So pushing for the PG rating, your movie now becomes basically a commercial, a 2-hour commercial. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was clearly marketed towards kids, and they had a ton of merchandise ready to go, including action figures, cereals, video games, all the usual, crap put out by studios. So the movie was a massive hit, and it opened on a record-breaking weekend for the time. It would end up coming up just behind other massive hits that year, including Ghostbusters and Beverly Hills Cop 2, for the highest-grossing movie of 1984. Indiana Jones would end up bringing in $179 million just in the U.S., which converted for today would be around $428 million. So very significant. And remember, movies showed on far fewer screens at the time. But then parents flipped out. Trusting the PG rating, kids would end up being freaked out and traumatized by the excessive violence and gore. Parents thinking they were going into basically a family movie were in for a rude awakening. Say like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids is a PG rated movie, and these two cannot be side by side. Parents were screaming that it should have been rated R. Critics, though most of them did love it, couldn't help but point out what this might be doing to children. A review from Variety magazine from 1984 would state that the movie, quote, might prove extraordinarily frightening to younger children who, indeed, are being catered to in this film by the presence of the adorable 12-year-old. People magazine called it a cinematic form of child abuse. So not only were critics and parents rebuking this lack of rating, but Spielberg's own friends started saying he took it too far with this one. They had let a lot of things slide with things like Gremlins, which really is a horror movie and a Christmas movie. Check out my other podcast all about that one. But the Temple of Doom was just too much. The issue had come up with the PG-rated Jaws in 1975, but they at least had a warning on the movie poster saying it would be too intense for children. So Spielberg started to think there needed to be a solution to this issue. He stayed adamant that Temple of Doom shouldn't have an R rating, but he realized there needed to be something that bridged the gap between PG and R, as that was such a wide range. He needed something that would allow him to push his vision, as violent as that may be, while not isolating kids they were trying to sell products to, and also to sell a crap load of movie tickets. So a compromise was created that would end up changing movies forever. Spielberg went to Jacques Vallée, who was president of the Motion Pictures Association, about bridging the gap. And this is a quote from Spielberg. It says, I remember calling Jacques Vallée, then the president of the Motion Picture Association, and suggesting to him that we need a rating between R and PG because so many films were falling into another world, of unfairness. Unfair that certain kids were exposed to Jaws, but also unfair that certain films were restricted, that kids who were 13, 14, 15 should be allowed to see. I suggested let's call it PG-13 or PG-14, depending on how you want to design the slide rule. And Jack came back to me and said, we've determined that PG-13 would be the right age for the temperature of movie. So I've always been very proud that I had something to do with that rating. That they proposed PG-13, a PG-14, and a PG-2 rating, which still kind of hazy what that was supposed to be about. The MPAA thought that PG-13 would be the right one to go for. So the rating got up and running pretty quick and was already established in July. By August 10th, 1984, just 3 months after the Temple of Doom, they were already using the PG-13 rating. And the very first movie to get it, Red Dawn, starring Patrick Swayze. So here's why financially this was one of the best ideas ever in movie history. PG-13 is perfect. Teens know it's not going to be a kiddie movie that they'd have to take a younger sibling to, and parents know it's going to be intense but not as bad as an R-rated movie. You know that you're going to get some violent swearing, maybe the odd exposed body part. It just wasn't going to go too over the top with those things. Past movies weren't going to be re-rated, but now any major blockbuster movie that was put out from August 1984 forward would carry it. And this is what I meant about PG-13 being the seal of approval. Like, as a kid growing up in the 80s, this was brand new to us. And hearing the use of it in commercials, when they would say rated PG-13, it had such a good ring to it. It just meant this thing was going to be good. R-rated movies up to that point had been huge. Beverly Hills Cop was R-rated and was the highest grossing movie of 1984. Purple Rain and Police Academy were also up there. But today you never see R-rated movies in the top 10. This is because those movies from 1984 could have done even better. How many more people would have seen Beverly Hills Cop if it was PG-13? I was dying to see it, but again, there was no way in hell I was going to be allowed to. PG-13 would be the new standard for studios. Billion-dollar movies didn't start happening until PG-13 was invented because not everyone could see them. 6 of the top 10 highest domestic grossing films of all time are PG-13, including the number 1 overall, Endgame, also Avatar, which is not too far behind it. They're sort of neck and neck. The highest grossing R-rated movies of all time were led by The Passion of the Christ until Deadpool came along. And its overall gross was around $370 million. That puts it at number 40 on the all-time list. Studios just don't want to risk anything with R-rated movies today. Even Deadpool came out with their recut PG-13 version before Christmas, so more people, younger people basically, would be able to see it. PG-13 is perfect because it's slightly geared towards adults but won't turn young people off. PG has now been associated as a family movie, and it ultimately can be the kiss of death for studios unless it is animated. So that's a quick look at the whole PG-13 thing. I go a lot deeper into it in the other podcasts and archives, but just a quick rundown on a pretty interesting story. Speaking of interesting stories, we're going to look into one of my absolute favorite topics related to the 80s, and it's the E.T. Atari video game. And again, I've covered a way more in-depth episode on this, but here's the quick rundown. It's hard to think that there was a point when video games almost ceased to exist, and they were seen as the kiss of death for toy companies. And this is related to what's called the Great Video Game Crash of 1983. And the E.T. Atari video game is seen as responsible for it, if, not 100% directly, but you'll see why. Obviously, everyone knows about E.T., released in 1982 by Steven Spielberg. Came out on June 12th. Immediate blockbuster. Many people don't realize, but it actually surpassed Star Wars and became the highest grossing film of all time. Lasted for an amazing 11 years until another Spielberg movie, Jurassic Park, broke the record. So, with everything to do with E.T., merchandising was obviously an intelligent way to go, and video games were still, at their peak. With Atari coming out in 1979, going in the 80s, these things were massive, and they knew the success that could happen when you put out a video game version of the movie. So it all starts with a guy named Howard Scott Warshaw, and he was the man behind the E.T. video game. If you know your Atari games, he was the creator of Yar's Revenge, one of the best games of all time. And what made him the go-to choice and why they wanted to do this game in the first place is he made the Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark video game for Atari, which was an awesome game too. And it was actually the very first movie adapted into a video game. So when they made the Raiders game, it took 10 months, which is pretty fast for a video game, especially back then. That includes writing code, getting feedback, reprogramming, putting it through quality control, pretty fast turnaround. Here's the problem from that year. Getting any form of video game out, obviously by Christmas, is absolutely paramount. And Spielberg and Atari were haggling over money for months, cutting into the game design. By the end of this, they had 5 weeks to make the Christmas deadline. It's insane, but Warshaw said he could do it. So he basically bunkered down in his house and had like a coding station set up there. So he was working around the clock as well. He'd go into Atari as well too. He actually had I don't know if you want to call it a personal assistant or manager, but they treated him almost like a racehorse, and they would schedule his sleep in, tell him when he had to sleep, get up. Like, he didn't do anything but think of this game. When he started it, he only had 36 hours to come up with the concept of the game. Spielberg wanted something like Pac-Man, but with E.T. having to eat Reese's Pieces, which is not a bad idea, but Warshaw wanted to make something more elaborate, involving E.T. able to go into different worlds as opposed to stuck on one screen. He wanted E.T. to move, freely in many directions, but to fall down in pits, which would be a massive downfall of this whole thing. Eventually, they signed off on the game. Warshaw's now under the gun, and he did it. He completed the thing in 5 weeks to get this thing out for Christmas. So if you've ever played this game, it sucks. And I remember playing, my neighbor had it. I never had Atari, but my neighbor had it, and he got it for Christmas. And I don't recall kids ever being so excited for a game because the packaging, if you remember back in the 80s, how good Atari packaging looked like, because the gameplay was so simplistic and the technology was not that advanced that you're basically either being a little cube or a square moving around, but the art on the box and the cartridge kind of would be more to capture your imagination. It was something Nintendo got away from when the NES first came out. They didn't want to mislead people, so they showed pixelated images of the character and the game, so you were playing exactly what you saw. Atari tried to trick you into this, but playing this game, I remember thinking how frustrating it was, and my neighbor, who loved everything, really had trouble hiding his dissatisfaction for it. So the problem in the game is in the form of frustration. It's confusing as hell. You got to collect pieces of a phone to put together to phone home. You have to avoid government agents trying to catch you as ET. And since there were multiple worlds, you could go in every direction, but there was no flow to the progress of the game. It's not like a Mario game where you were continuously moving left to right. You were always falling into these pits. You'd get up, you'd fall down again. Again, just frustrating. The pieces of the phone were scattered in the pits. There was an energy bar thing that would drop every time. And you could find Reese's Pieces to restore some of the energy, but they look like little pebbles. And again, you played it and then just gave up on it and went back to playing like Pac-Man or Adventure. And, kids generally will stick with a game, providing the gameplay is good. It should leave you wanting more. But the thought was, this is awful. And if, kids in my neighborhood are thinking that, are they thinking it all around the country in North America too? And they were. So the response was kids hated it. And it took a while, though, for that to spread. Even if the internet and texting existed, most 8-year-olds aren't going to have access to that. So what would lead to the spread of how bad this game was word of mouth by, on playgrounds, in neighborhoods. It took a while. There was so much hype over this game, though, that the trickle-down effect didn't hit immediately. It was as bad as the game was. The initial sales were amazingly strong. It was top of the charts for video games. It reached number 4 in the top 15 that year. It sold 1.5 million copies, but they made 4 million of them. So now with the word of mouth spreading, it's amazing that like a bunch of 8 and 10-year-olds could almost take down an industry here, but retailers started reporting that ET was not meeting expectations sales-wise. Low sales combined with excess inventory added to the kids hating it and returning the game is like the perfect storm of retail hell. So now you've got this huge movie that's universally loved and praised, and the video game version, which kids were now like using as frisbees. A lot of money, I think around $18 million, was put into the licensing of this game, and they were not seeing the returns. There was now actually a negative association with ET in general, and then it gets worse. Atari had been on top of the world. They were basically the only game in town and could put out any piece of crap game they wanted. Like, what were you going to do? Go play Nintendo? Sorry, that doesn't exist yet. But other, competitors are slowly starting to enter into the market. The NES isn't going to be out until 1985, and it wasn't the main factor, but the failure of the ET video game was connected to Atari losing $536 million in 1983. ET was giving the Atari 2600 a bad name, and people were starting to distance themselves from the console. It was said that the failure of the ET video game was responsible for ending the product life of the Atari 2600. And, now, as with, the NES not being there, but with these other competitors, you have the ColecoVision, you have the Odyssey, you've got Intellivision, you've got the Coleco Gemini, you've got the Sears Telegame system, you got the Commodore 64, where you could not only play those same games, you could do a ton of other stuff on it. Not to mention, the whole idea of the personal computer is taking off with the Apple One. And again, they're much more advanced than this video game console. So when you combine all this like new competition and the new advent of the home computer, along with the flood of crappy Atari games that are out on the market, not just the ET Atari video game. When third-party designers are allowed to put out anything and there's no quality control done by Atari, there's garbage everywhere. That's why you remember the Nintendo seal of quality. That was imperative as part of their success, that they had control over everything that went out. So all this together, and the ET Atari video game is like the straw that broke the camel's back. It starts a snowball effect on Atari and the video game industry. Retailers started stocking less Atari video games after the ET debacle, and sales dropped from $3.2 billion in 1982 to only $100 million in 1985. Atari's value ended up dropping by $1.3 billion, and shares were lowered from $54 to $34. Even in 1982, the revenues were cut by 50%. They thought that was going to be the worst of it, but the company would end up being divided and sold by 1984. And I mentioned, that's the great video game crash, and that seems funny that video games were, no one wanted to touch them with a 10-foot pole, and companies like Hasbro, Mattel got so burned by this whole video game crash, they wanted nothing to do with it, and they went back to more traditional toys. And that's why we see things like the Pound Puppies and Teddy Ruxpin and things that like Micro Machines. They went back to simple things like toy dolls and bears and cars, just because they thought this whole thing was done. And it would obviously, take the introduction of the NES to, create a renaissance. And then, that obviously changed everything forever. And then they would propel a whole new generation of video games and consoles, saving the whole industry. And, it allowed for ET and Atari to fade into the background. And there's been, renewed interest in this whole ET thing. You've probably seen the Netflix documentary, and just, people looking back on this thing sort of fondly, but, kind of baffled at what this game was capable of doing as far as, being partly responsible for destroying a company. It's an amazing story. And it's not just like, it goes beyond corporate greed. It's an example of companies getting just too cocky for their own good and the fallout that can happen. It's also an amazing story of, like how I mentioned, how 8-year-olds who basically didn't give a crap about this tripe being shoved down their throats would, also be responsible for taking down an industry too. E.T., the video game, it's probably not the worst video game ever, but it's probably definitely the most disappointing game ever. Okay, I'll cut that off there. Again, you can go back and listen to the in the archives, the whole longer edition, which goes more in depth about things with Atari and everything like that. Okay, let's move on to something, again, like was way off my radar until I sort of stumbled upon this whole thing about the Top Gun VHS and the release in 1986 and the emergence of home video and how important this release really was for how we changed home media consumption. And probably the most interesting thing I'd say I learned this year. So we start with just a quick look at the advent and sort of growth of the VCR and, the Betamax VHS wars. And I did a whole episode on VHS versus Beta, which is very interesting, and why the VHS rule basically came out on top over Beta and everything like that. And it actually doesn't have to do with quality, which is always the misconception that Beta was a far superior format. But by 1985, 30% of households owned a VCR. So it's an amazing thing because now you can capture live TV and also get to watch or own a movie that had recently been out in theaters. Before that, you would have to wait years for it to hopefully be played on a major network or for a re-release to happen in the theater. Studios were releasing movies for home video in the late 70s, but not only did they cost a fortune, this is when, the advent again of the VCR was just not accessible for most people. The players cost as much as some people's cars. The original VCR sold for around $1,200. If you convert that for today's money, $5,500. Not a lot of people could do this. So this is the late 70s. Even by the early mid 80s, movies were still out of reach for most people. Studios wanted to keep their movies because they'd make more money when they put them out in theaters. So when they put them onto this new video format, they would go, in the top movies in 1985-86 cost around $80. And that's at that era's prices. If you convert for today, that's around $180 per video. So no one could own these things. And again, they didn't have any interest in home video because the re-release put the movie back into theaters. They give it a short break from its original run. If the movie wasn't, if it didn't do as well as they thought, they could sort of remarket it, again, take it in a different direction. So the re-release was huge because there weren't a lot of entertainment options at the time. So people were willing to check out something that was a huge hit if it was going to come out again, if they missed it the first time around. Jaws is the best example of this because the hype had grown over time and people who missed it the first time around jumped all over the re-release. Disney also very notable for doing this by putting out their classics at various times. They'd throw them back into the vault and you'd have to wait however many years before you were able to see Fantasia or Cinderella again. So the thought was the studios were going to lose a lot of money because of home video, and they set the prices on those initial releases at the $80, the super high price, so they could make up for what they wouldn't get from the theatrical re-release. So it made sense, but again, this stifles the home video market going into the 80s. But this takes us into video rental. So remember, they're releasing the movies to buy, but video rental hadn't been a thing yet. And again, the only way you could see this movie at home was to have to buy one of these outrageously crazy priced tapes. But the way to stick it back to these studios was with the whole idea of renting them. So video rental at first was something that was actually illegal. There weren't big chains like Blockbuster right off the bat, and it was the smaller little independent video stores that would start doing it. So the studios cried foul over this, saying it was a copyright violation of some sort because it was considered a public screening and that was illegal. So again, I don't know how old you are, if you remember your little local video stores, but the video stores combated this by creating rental clubs, and they actually treated it similar to a country club. So I don't know, again, if you remember when these stores first came out, you had to pay annual dues. So it seems crazy, but this was their workaround to the problem. These fees weren't always cheap, but they were also to offset the cost of buying these horrifically priced videos so that they could rent them for a reasonable price. And, paying that dues and having this sort of country club approach allowed them, loophole-wise, to lease out the videotapes. And then Tom Cruise played volleyball with his shirt off. So Top Gun comes out in 1986. It's the story, of course, of, the elite fighter pilots at a weapons school where they compete to be the best. Top Gun was a huge hit with an iconic soundtrack. The Top Gun anthem itself was amazing. You've got Danger Zone by Kenny Loggins, originally pitched to Bryan Adams first, but he didn't want anything to do with a war-based movie. So the movie itself had mixed reviews from critics, but the audiences ate it up. Within a few weeks after it opened, the number of theaters showing it increased by 45%. The movie was made for a very paltry $15 million, which even seems low for the 80s. It made back around $356 million, which converted for today is over $800 million. So monster hit. The biggest hit of 1986. So this is where the home video issue comes in. So usually movies are selling for $80, $100 a pop. There was the odd time they would be a bit cheaper. They would sometimes throw, Beverly Hills Cop or something like that for $40. Maybe Indiana Jones. They do a little sort of promotional cheaper, the $40 range. But remember, that's the equivalent of $92 today when you convert it. So Paramount turns everything on its head by selling Top Gun on VHS for $26.95. This was the lowest that any feature film had ever been sold for by far. But it's not a mistake or poor planning. If you own Top Gun on VHS, you remember that the tape was front-loaded with a Diet Pepsi commercial. This was Paramount's way of being able to not take a big hit on missed revenue from a re-release, but making it more affordable for people who all clearly loved the movie and wanted to take it home with them. This had never been done before. And one of the appeals of home video was that you didn't have to watch commercials like you did on TV. But this was the trade-off with the consumer. You get a cheaper movie that you love that you can watch as many times as you want, but you've got to sit through a commercial or at least fast forward through it to the point you're aware of it. Paramount was marketing this thing hard through an $8 million campaign, and the deal with Pepsi would help alleviate some costs and the hit that studios usually took from putting a movie out on home video. And it worked. The advanced demand was so high that the pre-sales made it the highest selling video cassette in the history of the whole industry. This was before it was even available in stores. So the whole campaign, obviously a huge hit, and made everyone involved in movies, kind of raise their eyebrows at this home video thing. It also worked well for Pepsi. Then they would approach Steven Spielberg. So E.T., we've talked about, was still the highest grossing movie of all time. Even when it came out in 1982, but it never come out on VHS because they just wanted to keep putting it out in theaters every couple years, basically from now until eternity. So Pepsi made them an offer and convinced them to put E.T. out on home video with their commercial in it, of course. And they threw a lot of money at Spielberg and pushed for a $24.95 price point. It also included a $5 rebate from Pepsi that would bring the movie down to $19.99. Or roughly what we pay for movies today. The other big thing is that Pepsi kind of now owns Spielberg and E.T.'s soul and Spielberg's soul and whatever, and they could start using E.T. in any commercial they wanted. So at this point, Coca-Cola's lizard brain fires up and they want a slice of that sweet pie. They would get on board with movies like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and Batman by, quote, sponsoring the video with Diet Coke commercials to make it more affordable. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles would follow the same formula by partnering with the very on-brand Pizza Hut to offset the cost of their video release. I owned all these movies, but I don't remember specifically the commercials, except for the Diet Coke one in Batman. I don't know why I remember that one specifically. It obviously worked. Retail prices would vary over the coming years, with new releases always being higher, but this would end up replacing the money the studios would make on re-releasing the movie in theaters. So these days, unless you want to wait for a movie to come to Netflix or wherever, the cost of paying for it in a streaming capacity, whether it's you stream the rental price, or even if you like physically rent a movie. I don't know if people still do that, but some definitely do. The rental price can vary a bit, depending on what format. But if you buy a movie today, it's still around that $20 to $25 mark, whether it's DVD or Blu-ray. And that's been set because of all the way back in 1987 when Top Gun came out. They established this new home video market and what the costs and prices would be, and that's continued to today. So that's the story of the Top Gun VHS. And then I think this segues nicely as we've touched into Batman, and now we're looking at the great Michael Keaton backlash of 1988. If you know your comic books and your movies and stuff like that, and you grew up at the time, you'll remember this pretty well. But if not, this is another interesting story for you. We all know how great 1989's Tim Burton's Batman is, and how awesome Michael Keaton is as Batman. But this wasn't the case going into the movie. And it kind of involves looking back at the whole idea of comic books and movies in general. And this is a whole massive thing, but just to sort of, gloss over it. Again, at this time, it's hard to think that a comic book movie couldn't be successful if you look at Marvel and DC and whatever. But when Superman came out in 1978, it was seen as a big gamble to be released by a major motion picture studio. Comic book superheroes were too much kid fare that it was seen as overly juvenile and not worthy as a feature film. I mean, you could have your cartoon versions, no problem, but going beyond that was seen as really kind of movie suicide. And I think this all comes back to the old Batman TV show from the 60s, because it was such an over-the-top, campy, cartoony type of entertainment. And I think that just really became synonymous with comic books. So when they put out Superman in 1978, it was a definite risk. Even though Superman's the most famous comic book character ever, everyone's familiar with the story. So, if anything would work, it would be Superman, and it was still considered a risk at the time. I won't get too much into Superman, but obviously a massive hit, one of the, most famous movies ever, nominated for tons of Academy Awards. They got it right. But that would be as far as it would go, because then when the sequels came out, it just kind of derailed the whole franchise, and it slid downhill pretty quick. So the original Superman was seen as kind of a one-off hit, and people just doubted that the success could ever be duplicated again. So things are pretty quiet on the whole superhero front for nearly a decade. But during that whole time, the idea of developing a Batman movie was kind of being done in the wings. There was a guy named Michael Uslan, I think, 28-year-old comic fan and aspiring movie producer, and he snatched up the film rights to Batman in the late 70s, just because it was one of his favorites, and then seeing what was happening with Superman and everything like that. So, then he starts pitching the idea of a Batman movie, but studios are just straight out rejecting him. If the Superman movie was like pulling teeth to develop and it was seen as kind of a fluke success, no one was going to touch Batman. And again, because Batman is associated with the campy Adam West version. So this Uslan, I hope I'm saying that right, Uslan guy is starting to now talk to executives that he wants to change the whole direction of what the intent is. Instead of the cartoony campy approach, what if they went in the complete opposite direction? A dark and serious movie with a comic book character had never been done or attempted before. And it might be a way to create a brand new form of entertainment. So as good as Superman was, the sequels killed any momentum. And Batman as a character was pretty damaged because of Adam West, as good as that show was. So the comic books at the time, depending on how much of a fan of this you are, or if you grew up at the time, and if you like the comic books, that the DC comics of Batman distanced themselves completely from anything to do with like this superheroes or the movies or the cartoon. So they did this by putting out these very gritty, very dark contented versions of Batman. And now they were looking at maybe the approach the comics were taking was the right approach for a new movie. So again, it's this decade-long slog to bring Batman to the big screen since no one had faith in it. So because of all this, finding a producer was almost impossible, but that all changes after a movie called Pee-wee's Big Adventure, directed by young animator Tim Burton, who worked for Disney early on, which is hilarious. Pee-wee's Big Adventure was the perfect combination of direction and art direction, and many people have never really seen this combination before. Tim Burton was not a comic book guy per se, but he had the sensibilities and vision, and that's what was needed to bring a new version of Batman to the big screen. So getting him on board is the real turning point in all of this, and along with other talented writers, designers, actors, musicians, architects, they've got like a dream team together. So they've got everything and everyone they need in place, and they're going to create this shadowy, gritty, psychologically rich style of movie that was not for kids and was going to attract an older crowd. At the core story of all this, the story of Batman is really the story of Bruce Wayne. And if you've seen Joker, you know how deep this can go with these sort of psychological damaging effects that happen to these characters and how they emerge from that. So, we're not necessarily looking at Batman, we're looking at Bruce Wayne. And Bruce Wayne is, he's the one with the dark and damaged past. And he develops that into the vigilante of Batman. He's a tortured soul. Even though he's rich, he's always longing for something. So the idea of Batman is that it would be a character-driven focus and not just a superhero action movie. So this is where it gets all into Michael Keaton. How are they going to find the perfect person to play him? Because it all comes down, you can get a big muscular guy who's good at action. You can get a Schwarzenegger, but it's the character study. That's what's going to make this movie effective. So often forgotten as one of the other characters in the Batman movies is the city of Gotham, because it served, again, Joker's done this pretty well too. The city serves as a character, and it gives a certain tone and a feel, and that needed to be just right. So they did accomplish that. And then they get Jack Nicholson to play the Joker, and that's a big deal to get him to come out. They wanted him to really capture what he had done with Jack Torrance in The Shining, this sort of maniacal version instead of the cartoony, campy version from the TV show and the cartoons that we would know. So you've got everything in place. You've got the right tone with the design of the movie, the aesthetic. You've got the heavyweight actor and legend in Jack Nicholson. So who are they going to cast to play across from all this? So the producing team was made up of two guys named John Peters and Peter Gruber. And again, like I said, they decided they didn't want to cast an unknown who looked like Batman the way Superman did with Christopher Reeves. Like, they didn't want to base their casting around a tall, muscular, athletic guy. They wanted to base their casting around a purely dramatic star, who happened to be tall and well built and everything like that. So Tim Burton, even though he's been working on this script for Batman, he also puts out a movie called Beetlejuice. The success of Pee-wee's Big Adventure allowed him some freedom now to make some stuff and, kind of do what he wanted to do. But even though Warner Brothers paid for the Batman script development, they still didn't want to greenlight the whole thing. So with all the red tape, that's why Tim Burton went to make Beetlejuice, because it was more creative, it was unusual, and he could kind of if you think back to even Edward Scissorhands, and he could bring his specific style and tone to the movie. And while doing this, he was suggested that the character Beetlejuice be played by this actor named Michael Keaton, and he was actually suggested that by music mogul David Geffen. Burton had never heard of Michael Keaton, but he trusted David Geffen's, approach and thoughts. So Beetlejuice is another commercial and critical success, actually earning multiple Oscar nominations. And then this finally cleared the way for Batman. They trusted Burton enough. They're like, okay, you can do this. The thing is, Burton was going to bring Michael Keaton along to play Batman, and that's when everyone went nuts. So since Batman was going to be a study of Bruce Wayne, Burton believed that Keaton had the acting chops to get inside the head of Wayne and give him that darker tone. Burton made mention that it was Michael Keaton's eyes that were a big selling point in giving him the role. As he said, they had a very wild look to them, which he thought fit in with the character of Bruce Wayne. But Keaton was actually a comedic actor at his core, and he was known, I don't know if you remember Mr. Mom, he was known for his work in that. So how could he play a superhero? Not to mention, he's not even tall. He's not built like a comic book hero. Burton was going full on with the dark tone of the movie, and he wanted to mirror what he had seen in the comics, specifically The Dark Knight Returns and The Killing Joke. So he's got his mindset, and all of it's coming together, but it's creating this massive backlash by fans and even the studio. They were thinking having Burton meant the movie was going to be too much like Pee-wee's Big Adventure. You think of Batman and you think of the campy 60s show. You think of Michael Keaton and you think of comedies. There's no way this is going to work, and this is not the right guy. Why weren't they at least going with some of the big actors who the Warner Brothers wanted to play Batman? They wanted Mel Gibson. They wanted Harrison Ford. That Tom Selleck was in the mix. Charlie Sheen, Kevin Costner, Dennis Quaid, Pierce Brosnan, Ray Liotta. Purists and comic book fans hated the idea of Michael Keaton playing Batman, and they were very vocal about it. Could you imagine if the internet existed back then? The entire web would have melted into some sort of scrap heap. It was so bad that Warner Brothers Studios received 50,000 letters over the protest of the casting choice of Michael Keaton. And like I said, the studio wasn't even along with it. Even the people involved with the movie weren't stoked on the choice of Michael Keaton, including Uslan and even Batman creator himself, Bob Kane. They had mentioned, this is Uslan speaking, I was the very first one that was apoplectic when I heard about Michael Keaton that Tim wanted. I went absolutely crazy. He also says the dramatic bellowing was so great and huge coming only from the mainstream press. So it was only magazines, newspapers, radio, and TV. And the world was inundated to the point that I thought the fans were going to show up and surround Warner Brothers with torches and pitchforks. Again, no internet, no blogs, no YouTube videos, no forums. This is all like word of mouth. And if you remember this time, I remember this very well. You remember how this just wasn't pretty. This is an editorial from the LA Times, July 3rd, 1988. Keaton might have made a good Joker, but his comic style, which he seems unable to shake but can amplify, has doomed this serious treatment of Bob Kane's character to the same tired, boring level of artificial camp that made the TV series a hit, yet simultaneously doomed it to an early cancellation. By casting a clown as Batman, Warner Brothers and Burton have defecated on the history of Batman and on the hopes of those who appreciate the character and his potential. The movie hasn't even come out yet, and this is what people are saying about it. Comic-Cons were like starting to become a thing then, and at all the different ones, whether it was like Chicago or New York, whatever, the sentiment going around was they thought Batman was going to be Beetlejuice blended with Pee-wee's Big Adventure. We know what a success and a hit Batman is, but at the time, everyone's up in arms. But then Uslan, the guy who was the main producer who got everything up and running for Batman, starts to understand slowly where Tim Burton was coming from about the casting of Michael Keaton. And that was before he ever even saw the final product. He knew how brilliant Tim Burton was, and in that the goal was to make the world buy this new version of a comic book movie. And he also made the point that in a heavyweight actor like Jack Nicholson, you needed someone who could go toe-to-toe with him. Nicholson would wipe the screen with an unknown actor, but Michael Keaton could hang with him. And again, it all comes back to being about Bruce Wayne. And then they are realizing as they're watching, the early development that Keaton had the dramatic chops to pull this off. They were able to see a rough cut edit of a movie called Clean and Sober that Keaton had made, and then they realized how good he actually was. When they started seeing the very early footage and the dailies, they started to really get put at ease, and especially because of a specific moment, and that was the execution of the classic line, "I'm Batman," when he's holding the criminal above the building and the criminal asks, "Who are you?" When they saw that line, they saw that Keaton helped return the character to the darkness and the dignity created way back in 1939. And that was an improvised line. The script called for, when he says, "Who are you?" he's supposed to respond, "I am the Knight." And instead he returned with that, "I'm Batman." So then when Batman comes out, again, if you grew up in that time, you remember how massive this thing was. It made $40 million its opening weekend and, smashed the records. It was the fastest movie ever to 100 million. It finished with 411 million worldwide. If you adjust for today, that's around 850. It made $150 million in home video sales, which we touched on before. The interesting thing here is it's considered that in North America alone, it sold around 60 million tickets. If you consider today that the average movie price is around $9.01, you're looking at making around $540 million. That would put it around 5th on the list of highest grossing Marvel movies. So it was a monster hit is what I'm trying to say. And remember, it opened on way fewer screens. Say a Marvel movie opens on around 4,300 screens. Batman opened on just 2,194. Batman is also responsible for making the opening weekend box office receipts become much more important, and it narrowed the time between theatrical release and home video release. Before that, as we touched on before, movies took forever to be released on video. There was such a demand for Batman to be able to be taken home and watched at home on video that the time was shortened to get it into stores while it was still hot. So that's a quick story on the Michael Keaton backlash of 1988. And we know how this whole franchise has developed and grown and, into the, Christian Bale and to what Batman has become with the Dark Knight and Christopher Nolan's approach. But it all started back then. The anger at Michael Keaton at the time was justified. I remember that as a younger kid thinking that's a stupid choice. So people, I think, were right in feeling that way over something they, protected and held dear, but it was ultimately a brilliant decision. Okay, that's it for me. I hope you liked what I thought were some of the best things from the 80s that I saw in 2019. Thanks for listening to the show. If you really like it, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcasts. I should be there. If you really, really like it, leave a rating and review. That helps the show out. But thanks for spending the time with me. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.